Alright, ladies and gentlemen, I was going to wait some time and then do this one, but I'm here, and here we are. So we may as well just keep on going, right? Right. So here we are. We're on the fourth page of the study guide. We really only have to get through fourth, and the fifth page will probably take about 10 minutes, and we'll be done with this unit. Hope these videos are helpful. If they're not helpful, let me know what I can do. I'll be happy to add, subtract, do whatever you need me to do. We're going to start off with imperialism. Imperialism is the push towards European involvement in Africa and Asia, in particular in the late 19th century, in an effort to achieve a number of goals. This is kind of like the colonialism we saw in the 15th and 16th century voyages of exploration, but it involves a heavier hand, a much stronger influence and involvement from the Europeans. Let's talk about what the motives are here. Number one, money. At the root of all of this, it's always about money, because if you weren't making any money going, you probably wouldn't be doing it very often. European countries were producing so many goods as part of the Second Industrial Revolution that you're looking to sell constantly. Your country can't possibly meet your production. There's not enough demand within your country. Other European countries perhaps have their own goods to sell their people. So you're always looking for a constant source of buying those things and selling them to a colony as sort of a surefire market, saying, hey, I don't know if you need this, but you need blank, and here it is. And I don't know if you knew this, but you need that, and you sell them that as well. And that built up economic strength within your country, while at the same time giving you massive sales abroad. The other side of it is that you might be looking for resources. Places might have something that become incredibly lucrative for you, like gold and diamonds that the British found in South Africa, or the Congo. Right? The Congo is a massive African colony that's managed by Belgium, and the leader of Belgium, Leopold II, took it upon himself to really just fleece all of the rubber reserves out of the Congo and use them for his own vast personal fortune. He thought that was completely fair, and I suppose all's fair in the imperialist world. But as I said, sometimes you're looking to buy and sometimes you're looking to sell, sometimes you're looking to do both. Number two, nationalism. The countries in Africa became really the must-have accessory of late 19th century European countries. Everyone who was anyone had an African colony. Consider that the British, the French, the Germans, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Italians, all of them had states. The Belgians as well. I just mentioned Belgium. Now Russia doesn't have them, a little busy with themselves. Austria-Hungary doesn't have them, got their own internal problems. Really, everyone else does have this push towards African countries. Only two African states remain independent after what we call the scramble for Africa. That's Liberia and Ethiopia. But besides that, the rest of the landmass is really divvied up at the 1885 Congress of Berlin. While trying to draw within the lines as best as possible, the people at the Congress of Berlin divvied up Africa to each other in a way of saying, here's what we think is fair. Now, the British and the French walked away with substantial portions, but really everybody got their fair share. We're going to look for imperialism in Asia as well. We're not talking about that as much right here, but in Africa it was pretty heavy. Number three, this notion of a white man's burden, that you as a European have a superior civilization, and that civilization needs to be expanded abroad. The title comes from a Rudyard Kipling poem expressing the fact that this may not be the easiest job, it may not be one you get thanked for, but it's something that's being called for and you have to do it. Rouging then over into the fourth answer, we talk about the fact of people having this notion of social Darwinism. Now, social Darwinism is a Herbert Spencer idea. Spencer took Darwin's scientific theories and applied them then to cultures and races of people and said that there were superior people and there were inferior people. And it was within the rights of the superior people to sort of step over the inferior people on their way to greatness. Pretty rough stuff. The next question asks us about technology, and technology certainly does make a difference. Steamboats, which are instrumental in being able to push up into the major rivers of Africa, without which they never would have made it into kind of the hinterland of Africa. Also quinine, which is enormously important for malaria. Remember, I used in class the phrase white man's grave. That's what Africa was. It was the white man's grave. And before people realized that the bark of the cinchona tree, which is where we get our quinine, could cure malaria, or help you avoid getting malaria, let's put it that way, people dropped like flies everywhere. European expeditions would go down with 150 people, and 3 of them would come back. I mean, they would just sit off the shore and just die. This made it possible for them to get in there and stay long periods of time, and so Africa was no longer a death trap. The machine gun, for reasons I hope that are pretty straightforward. Specifically, I'm going to ask you about the Battle of Omdurman in the Sudan in 1898, when the British in one afternoon downed 10,000 Ethiopians or 11,000 Ethiopians and lost 28 people. Those numbers speak for themselves. The machine gun's a powerful thing. What did the natives say about all of this? Well, we highlight a couple of events here where the local people fought back. One of them is called the Sapai. I know it looks like Sepoy, but Sapai is the correct pronunciation. The Sapai Rebellion or Mutiny, where Indian soldiers fought back against British rule in India. This is a year-long revolt, and a part of it comes from the fact that a lot of these guys who were fighting in the army had lost their land and they'd lost their privileges, and some of their culture had been changed by the English. But what really seems to have sparked it is that the cartridges for the guns that they were using required them to bite the end off. You had to like this, and the top part of it had a tallow on it, a fat, and that fat had both beef and pork in it. Okay, and depending on what religion we're looking at, either Hinduism or Islam, that's going to upset one or the other. And some of the Indian troops came from one of those places. That upset them, and so there's this long-standing rebellion. Now, when the rebellion's over, the English get even more restrictive when it comes to India. So, in a way, the rebellion pushes the British towards a greater control. And the same can be said for the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxers were this group in China that fought back against foreign involvement in China. They didn't like the fact that there were so many foreigners there. And the Europeans and the Americans as well had been trying to sort of open the door to China. That's the key phrase with China, right? Open door policy, that everyone should have a right to trade with China. The Boxers fought back. They murdered a whole bunch of people. And then this combined foreign national force came in and shut them down, and refused to allow the old government to get back in until they made massive concessions. What they did was they so significantly weakened the Chinese government that it was ready for an overthrow. And shortly after 1911, it's down. Flipping the page. We're back to the European scheme of things and talking about kind of the setup for World War I. We don't really know this when we start on the top of the page here, but we're heading for 1914 and August, and it is going to go nuts. So let's sort of lay the track. Going all the way back to Bismarck. Bismarck's goal was to assure that the Germans never ever fought a war on two fronts. Right? They're kind of surrounded by friend enemies. We'll call them frenemies. We've got the French on one side, the Russians on the other side, the Austro-Hungarians beneath us, and the English off in the Channel. So you have to try and figure out who to befriend. The English are kind of off on their own. Bismarck's first attempt at diplomacy was what was called the Three Emperors League. The Germans, the Austro-Hungarians, and the Russians. That one didn't quite work out because the Russians and the Austro-Hungarians both had designs on the Balkan area, and so it fell apart. The more permanent one, the Triple Alliance, unites Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. This is really a defensive alliance. In other words, if you're attacked, you can rely on one of the other countries to come to your aid. The biggest piece of legislation that Bismarck pushes through is called the Reinsurance Treaty. Bismarck had a treaty with the Russians that in essence said, we're good. You're not going anywhere. We're not going anywhere. We're good. And that was brilliant by him. It assured that the Russians on his eastern flank were stable. Because the French are never going to be an ally of the Germans, right? We know that. There's too much bad blood. But that means he's got the Austro-Hungarians on his side. He's got the Italians on his side. He's got the Russians on his side. The French, never going to be friends, but don't worry about it. And the English across the English Channel in splendid isolation, kind of considered to be a friend. So frankly, we're good. And then he got fired. In 1890, the new leader of Germany, Wilhelm II, or William II, took it upon himself to fire Bismarck. Wilhelm was tired of the fact that Bismarck thought that he could run the show. William II's father, William I, had allowed Bismarck a huge amount of control of foreign policy, and the young kid thought, heck, I can do it better than the old man. So, out went Bismarck, in came William, and the trouble started. Two things I want to talk about. Number one, the treaty with Russia. In 1892, when the reinsurance treaty was due to be re-upped, William didn't want to do it. And so the Russians, now sitting alone diplomatically in Europe, ran to the first friend that they could find, albeit the French. The French and the Russians form an alliance in 1894. Now, Bismarck can only look at this and go, you let the Russians on the eastern flank and the French on the western flank unite on either side of you? Have I taught you nothing? Because now we are surrounded. Now we can't avoid a two-front war. Now the only war we can have is a two-front war. Brilliant. Okay, so there's mistake number one. Let's go with mistake number two. Mistake number two is that William started to rattle the saber at the English a little bit, right? The Germans have been coming along in the Industrial Revolution. They're building up the Navy. They're challenging the English, and the English are sitting on the other side of the channel, kind of resenting it. There's a little bit of antagonism. The Germans want their place in the sun. That's the great phrase. And the British don't want to give it to them. So as William begins to chip away at the friendly feelings of England, the English feel like they may need to suck up to someone soon. Who, though? The Germans would be the best friends they had. The Russians? Doesn't do them much good, really, does it? Although they're relatives, but so are the Germans. We'll talk about that later. The Austro-Hungarians? No thank you. The French? Traditional enemies? I don't know. We got to find some friends, though. So, continuing on. Back to Africa for a moment. In 1898, there's a crisis called Fashoda. Fashoda was a crisis. Fashoda. Right. The Fashoda crisis happened in the Sudan, basically an area of Africa that was claimed by the English, but the French wanted to challenge that claim. English forces and French forces met there, and there was a loggerheads. It looked like they were going to go to war. The English were ready to roll. The French, worried that they might get their backsides walloped, and that might also lead to war elsewhere, backed down. And it assured that there would not be a war. But it showed that imperialist ideals and imperialist gains could make for trouble in Europe. The next one's the Moroccan crisis. In 1905 and in 1911, the French tried to assert more strongly their right to settle Morocco. The Germans wanted to challenge that right. And the fact that Germany got so far involved in a territory that everybody else had agreed was really going to be settled by the French got people concerned. This is another one of those William II decisions, where everyone's looking around going, what is he doing? The Germans sent naval vessels down to Morocco in order to protect German interests, which is sort of key for we want to be here too. The French took it as a complete invasion against them. They armed up and got ready to attack, and eventually cooler heads prevailed in both 1905 and in 1911, but it made people fear William II and Germany. If William was looking to try and stabilize himself, he failed, because in essence he drove the English into the arms of the French. Now beginning to feel that there was nowhere else to go, the English made an alliance with the French, then made an alliance with the Russians. So here we have two armed camps. The alliance, as it's called, or the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy, and the Entente. The French, the English, the Russians. 6 big countries, all tied to each other. All it takes is 2 of them to fight, and it's on like Donkey Kong. And that's exactly what's going to happen. And why is it going to happen? Because of the problems going on in the Balkans. The Balkans are the mountain range where we find Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina and areas of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And I want to wrap this up before 15 minutes, so I'm going to try and be fast here. Serbia had become an independent state and was challenging the Austro-Hungarians for control of the area. They would like to establish their own big Slavic empire, but Austria-Hungary wanted that too, and the Russians wanted it as well. But in most domestic issues, the Slavs, like Serbia, looked to the Russians for guidance. So there was no way that Austria-Hungary could really push Serbia around without worried, but because the Russians would be pushing the Austro-Hungarians around if they pushed the Serbians around. And that might have been confusing, but you should understand this. Nothing can happen here without conflict. There are 3 Balkan wars before World War I breaks out, all of them over expansion in the area. Bulgaria wants land, Greece wants land, the Russians want land, the Austro-Hungarians want land, the Serbians want land. It is a powder keg, and that's what we call it, the powder keg. That's the end of the unit, ladies and gentlemen. Pretty soon we're going to watch one of the great videos in history. You'll see it in class. It's going to be good.